Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm really glad you're here. My name is Becca. This channel is all about my love for spinning, knitting, weaving, crocheting, sewing, all the fiber things. I invite you to grab whatever project you have on the go and join me. Let's make some stuff. Today I want to share with you some of my hand sewing. But first I thought I would give you some updates on my works in progress and my finished objects that I've been spinning and knitting on. The first finished object is my Seascape socks. These I finished just this morning. They are still damp on the blockers. This is a self-striping and self-patterning yarn from Knit Picks, and the color is actually called Seascape. So I decided these are 2 at a time toe up, which is sort of my standard approach for knitting socks. But I decided to, instead of just a plain leg, to do this wave pattern lace, just to sort of follow the theme a little bit. So I think they turned out really cute in this turquoise and sort of beach colors, sand and cream. They aren't exactly identical. I didn't start the color pattern in the same place, so that's kind of fun. And I did a semi-short row heel with a gusset, which I really like the way that fits. And then the heel flap is sort of a thicker texture, so that should help it wear a little bit nicer. So they're falling a little bit because they're wet. But yeah, first finished object to share with you, these are my Seascape socks. And then I've been making a ton of progress on my Attune shawls by Andrea Mowry, which I'm doing a spin and knit along this summer. And I decided that I would make 3 shawls, 2 of them with hand spun yarn that I had in my stash, and then the third I am spinning the yarn during this this project period, as well as knitting it. I'm spinning it with a friend who, this is her first time spinning, so that's been a lot of fun. But the first shawl is finished, and it probably will not be in frame because they are actually quite large. They are an asymmetric triangle, very textured. I haven't blocked this, so it's going to relax a little bit. But it's a really interesting knitting pattern where you knit with 2 colors of yarn. I've got, this one is in, the cream is a natural blue-faced Leicester wool, and then the sort of heathery purple dusky pastels is a wool that was dyed by Serenity Dyeworks in their spaced outline, which is just really lovely. And so I had spun both of these previously and just started with the shawl pattern for those. So works really well in hand spun yarn because of all the texture. It's very squishy, and I think it's going to be nice and cozy and warm. And very elegant in these sort of pastel colors, I think. So that's my first shawl. I also think it would work really well if you purchased yarn for this, because there's so much textures that that would also pop really nicely if you had a commercial yarn. So that's the first Attune shawl. I have my second one on the needles. Hopefully I can do this without losing stitches. It is getting kind of large. But this one is in, again, hand spun in this dark turquoise, which is Merino and Zwartbles. So it's got some black from that sort of black sheep mixed in. And then the second color is a 3-ply yarn that I spun in this sort of light gray, light green, light purple hints of color with Stellina sparkle. And I think it's just really turning out cool how different it looks from the other one. Sort of an evening feel, perhaps. But yeah, it's a lot of fun to knit this pattern. I'm about halfway done, so this first section with the textured stitches is supposed to be about 24 inches, and then you do another 12 or 13 inches in a simpler rib. I'm about to lose stitches here, so we need to be careful. And then it has just a garter stitch border around it. So yeah, there's my second Attune shawl, about halfway done. And then the third is the one that I am spinning this summer. I finished the bright contrasting color. This is another wool that was dyed by Serenity Dyeworks in the spaced out line. Really fiery and beautiful. I love how this spun up. It's reds and purple, or burgundies, red and burgundy and yellow. Some orange in there. So very fiery. I'm contrasting that with a Welsh Black Mountain sheep breed that I have just started spinning on. So it's got a little ways to go, but I think the contrast is going to be really cool with this one. I've been doing a lot of sewing recently, and I learned how to sew a long time ago. In one of my previous videos, I mentioned how my mother and my sister were professional seamstresses, so sewing was always a very natural thing for me to get into. I sewed a lot when I was in college, but then I really sort of put it away and didn't do much sewing. Until recently, when I had some health issues and lost a lot of weight, and so none of my clothes fit. And I really hate shopping for clothes, so here we are sewing a new wardrobe. And a couple of years ago I started watching a lot of YouTube videos from the costume community. So Morgan Donner and Rachel Maxey and Kathy Hay and Nicole Rudolph, and there's so many fantastic sewists on YouTube. I would definitely recommend that you check them out. Much better seamstresses than myself, or sewists than myself. However, I have decided to give hand sewing a try. So before I'd sewn with my machine. I don't have a fancy machine. It's actually my mother's machine from the 1970s, and it does basic stitches. So nothing fancy and computerized, but it does have a buttonhole stitch that I could do, and various zigzags and things like that. But yeah, I thought I would try my hand at sewing by hand. And in my typical fashion, I didn't start with a simple project for this. I had a thought that I wanted to sew a coat. I'd also never sewn a coat. I've never sewn with heavy wool fabric, or might have been the first time I made a lined garment as well. There's a full lining in this coat. So, you know, jump into the deep end and try lots of things at once. But I decided I wanted to try sewing it by hand. That coat is completely sewn by hand. So I cut out all the pieces and sat on my sofa instead of in my craft room, stitching away, and I think it took me the better part of a month to do all the hand sewing on these. The coat is quite long. It goes down past my knees, and it's just so wonderful. I am just over the moon with how this turned out. So if you've ever been thinking, maybe I'd like to try sewing a coat, do it. Definitely do it. It's so rewarding. So rewarding. But of course, there were some hiccups along the way. The first being, I went and bought this gorgeous, gorgeous deep burgundy wool. And I know that when you buy fabric, the first thing you are supposed to do is wash it how you're supposed to care for it. So that if it shrinks in the fabric and not in the garment. But this is wool, and I'd never really worked with wool in sewing before. You know, of course, I've done lots of work with wool and knitting, but I didn't know if I should wash the wool. And so I thought, well, I'm going to do dry cleaning with it when I'm done. I'm not going to wash it by machine or anything like that, so maybe it'll be fine. So I spread, of course, it's large. I don't have a large enough surface to lay out this fabric and these fabric pieces. So I laid it out on the floor. And I'm smoothing it along and putting the pieces down on it and sewing it down, or pinning it in place. And I looked at my hands, and my hands were just completely purple because the dye was not, well, the dye might have been set, but there was more dye than there needed to be. So the dye was getting on my hands, it was getting on my clothes, it was getting on my carpet, which was a problem. And I decided I needed to do something to get this extra dye out of this fabric, and it wasn't cheap, so I didn't want to mess it up. But I decided it would be fine. I knew how to handle wool, and so I washed the fabric. And it was fine. It was fine. I had to dry it over my shower curtain because it was so huge and wet and took forever to dry, even spinning all the extra water out with the machine. And it was heavy with all the water in it. But the dye did finally exhaust and get most of it out so that I could actually work with the fabric and not become purple on everything. So that was the first hurdle with the fabric. But once I pressed the wool, it was fine. It's not quite as perfectly smooth as it was when I first bought it, but it's still perfectly wonderful fabric. So I laid it out again on the floor and cut out all my pieces. If you've not cut through heavy fabric like this, take your time because it does wear you out to cut through multiple layers of thick fabric. It can be very hard on your wrists and hands. So that part took a while. Then of course I had the lining, which I will show you in a minute. But had all my pieces, had my instructions. This is a purchased pattern that I got. I also ran into a hurdle with that because I didn't think to take my measurements before I went to the store to buy the pattern, and I went based off of the sizes that they had rather than the actual measurements, body measurements. Definitely don't recommend that. The sizes on patterns are not equivalent to sizes in off-the-rack clothing at all. They are completely arbitrary, and essentially because of that, they are meaningless. I suppose if you only buy patterns from one maker, like McCall's, you can figure out where you are within their sizing system, but you can't transfer that sizing system from a McCall's pattern to a different brand. It doesn't work. So you always have to go based on your body measurements. Well, I didn't do that. I bought a pattern, and of course the pattern was too small. So I had to make a bunch of adjustments in the sizes. Luckily, I figured that out before I started cutting into my gorgeous, expensive wool fabric. I made a mock-up with some old sheets that I had, and so realized that I was on the right track with that. So my adjustments worked, but another caution, make sure you measure yourself before you go and buy a pattern, and don't try to use the size numbers on the patterns for anything at all. Just ignore those. Use your measurements. So, I did all of the sewing for this coat. It was a long time in the works, but it was very calming and pleasant. And I realized that I actually like hand sewing better than sewing by machine. I was really surprised to discover that about myself. I've heard so many people over the years talk about how they hate the hand sewing finishing. They hate having to do little bits of hand sewing because they want to just finish it out. Which is great. I get that, but I really liked it. I liked sitting, working through, one seam, seeing it come together in sort of this slow process. Maybe that's because I already did knitting, which is very slow, and spinning, which is even slower. That I have this tolerance for things that take time. But I found that I didn't feel rushed by it. I didn't feel stressed by it. Sometimes when I'm sewing by machine, it goes really fast and I get ahead of myself and make mistakes. I sew pieces together backwards, or I have made some error and then I have to rip out the seams. I didn't have to do that when I was sewing by hand. So that was nice. It was nice. I was worried that it wouldn't look nice, that I wouldn't be able to get my stitches even enough or small enough, or that it wouldn't be sturdy. It's actually more sturdy, I think, than had I made it by machine. So depending on the hand stitch that you do, it can be very, very sturdy and last for hundreds of years, as we can see in the clothing record of historic garments, which I think is really another reason that I like it, because it is that direct connection to how people created clothing in the past, and that really speaks to me. So the coat was the first project. I say everything is hand sewn on it. There was one part of it that was really giving me trouble, and that was the buttonholes, which we'll come back to in a moment. But the buttonholes, I was trying to learn how to make hand-stitched buttonholes, but they weren't coming out nice. They looked awful. They were really uneven and messy looking, and I didn't want to ruin what was turning into a really beautiful garment with my terrible, terrible, unpracticed buttonholes. So I did the buttonholes by my machine, just to finish that garment. And then I moved on to shirts. I had I think it was a silk shirt that I had purchased, a button-up shirt that I had worn for a long time, and it was worn out and it didn't fit me anymore. It was a little bit too small, and I decided I wanted to use that as a pattern to make new shirts. So I would adjust the size. I took this shirt and I cut apart all of the pieces very carefully along the seam lines, and made those into pattern pieces. And the first one that I used some cotton quilting fabric that I had in my stash. This is the shirt. I've worn these shirts so many times and I made many mistakes, but because this was fabric that I had in my stash, I thought if I mess it up, at least I didn't have a lot of money invested in it. So it's got some problems. I drew my seam lines on the right side of the fabric instead of the wrong side of the fabric, so those were remained for some time. I had a little spot on the front that I tried to clean, and it actually took some of the dye out, so I have a faded spot there. But it's a pretty basic long sleeve button-up shirt with a collar. It has a back yoke, which is 2 layers at the shoulders. The sleeves are set in. It has some darts in the chest, and then a button placket. Also has a cuff placket, and yeah, it's pretty straightforward shirt. This was completely stitched by hand. And I was super excited when I finished it, and it fit and it was attractive and it looked great. I also took this opportunity to learn how to make actual hand-stitched buttonholes. So these shirts have 9 buttons down the front and 3 buttons on each sleeve at the cuff. So 15 chances to practice making buttonholes. And by gosh, I know how to make a buttonhole now. Again, I thought, if this project looks awful, I don't really care, because I'm using this as an experience and a learning experience. But I made this and it was great, and so I went on to a second one. Also in quilting cotton, this is actually a little bit heavier. I purchased this online, and as you can see, I've worn it a lot, so it's a bit stained, and has gotten a lot of love. But exactly the same pattern, just cut out another one and went from there. Again, same number, 15 buttons down the front, and this fabric actually had a bit of a sparkle, had some glitter, gold glitter around the butterflies. That washed out very quickly when I washed it. I just throw these in my washing machine, and again, I've worn these a lot, so they've held up really, really, really well. Occasionally I'll have to mend a seam or a little bit where the stitching has come undone, but really minimal, and definitely not more than I would have had to do if I'd made them with my machine. Recently, as I said, I lost a lot of weight, and so I had to do some modifications on these. Had to take in quite a bit of fabric so that they could fit me and I could still wear them. So what I did was just took in the sides by stitching along a new seam line. So you see I have this basically 1 inch, so I took 2 inches in on each side, flap on the inside rather than cutting a new seam. I'd already finished the seam, so I didn't really want to have to finish it again, especially given the shape that they're in. They're worn and they probably should be retired anyway. But I did that, and I took a couple of darts in the back just to bring that in a little bit. So yeah, I can now wear my shirts again for specific contexts. They're not really work clothing shape anymore, but I can still wear them. I made one further one in the same pattern out of linen. I have this pink linen. It's very drapey, more drapey than the cotton quilting fabric. And I also was experimenting with different threads and thread waxing and learning all of these different techniques that people use for hand sewing. So I used silk thread with this linen fabric. I would not do that again, and I would not recommend it. Silk is very slippery, and the linen itself is slippery, and so as you can see, I had problems with the stitching staying in the seams because of that. So that was my beginner's mistake. Hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. But in general, the linen was really nice. I put wooden buttons on this one, which I thought was really cute and sort of natural looking. So those are my 3 button-up shirts, hand-stitched, all hand-stitched, including all the buttonholes. So I made those a couple of years ago. I did finally pull them out and do the mending so that I could wear them again by taking in some of the fabric and putting those darts in. But I've also purchased some new patterns that I want to share with you now. These new shirt patterns, I also used quilting cotton. which may or may not have been the best choice, but quilted cotton is fairly inexpensive, and it comes in lots of really nice patterns and colors, so I like to use it, but it's possible that some of these might be better in a drapier fabric. And they do wear really nicely, but this is the first one. It is a Raglan t-shirt. It's got two front panels seamed down the middle, and then a placket with a button. Again, I used a wooden button for this because I thought it was nice with the green floral. This one would benefit from a drapier fabric, I think. As you can see, it's intended to be nice and loose, and it does sort of want to stand out proud a little bit. But the more I wash it, the looser and softer it's getting. Also, the more I wash it, the more the color is becoming less saturated, because the nap of the cotton is actually coming up a little bit, which is okay. The coat, as I said, took me about a month to hand stitch. Each of these shirts took me, the first one probably took me 3 weeks to do, and I think I didn't really keep track how long they took. But the other two were much quicker because I had already figured out how the pieces go together, and so they were a week and a half each. So really not that long in the grand scheme of things when you're a knitter and you think about knitting a sweater and planning for it to take 3 months, 6 months, depending on the pattern. So this is the first of my new patterns. Again, for this one, I actually did check my measurements first, so I got the pattern in the right size, didn't have to make any modifications. I also didn't make any sort of mock-up with this. I thought, I'm just going to try it. It's sort of a loose pattern anyway, and so I based my sizing off of my measurements and selected the appropriate size for the chest and for the waist and for the hips, which was not the same size, so that's something to keep an eye out for. Your measurements may not be a single size, and you may have to grade from one size to the next. And then I really surprised myself with this one, because I went from cutting out the pattern to having a finished, completely finished, all the seams are finished on the inside and nicely stitched down, in 4 hours. This shirt took me 4 hours to hand stitch. I completely didn't expect that. I expected it would take several days. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's very simple and straightforward. There's a seam down the front, seam down the side, and front and back on either of the raglans. There's no collar. It's just the placket doesn't have a separate piece or anything like that. The little loop for the buttonhole is a separate piece, but it's a very basic shape. So there aren't that many seams, and the way the pattern is designed, you finish the seams as you go. Of course, it's written for finishing them with a machine, sewing the whole thing with machine, but I was easily able to adapt that to hand sewing. 4 hours. You can hand sew a shirt in an afternoon. I had no idea. So that, I've only made one of this pattern so far, but I do like it. I think it's great for summer. I will try it in a drapier fabric and see if I like that. I just haven't gone to purchase any more fabric. So that was my first recent hand-stitched shirt. The next one is actually the one that I'm wearing. This is a shirt that I stitched by hand. It's a pattern that is, again, fairly straightforward. This one does not have a seam down the front. It does have a placket. And it is more of a tunic, so it's open at the sides on the bottom. This 3/4 length sleeves turned back so they form sort of a self cuff that's stitched down so that it doesn't doesn't come undone. A lapel collar, and no buttons on this one. It's just a slip over the head, and it is really comfortable. I had this, got this fabric with the sort of night sky and stars. I thought was fun. And I've gotten a ton of compliments on it, which is a bit surprising because I sort of feel like a high school art teacher when I wear it, which I'm not a high school art teacher, but I enjoy that aesthetic. So this tunic was my next recent one. And then both of these are very loose, very sort of flowing, not very fitted garments. And I wanted to get more of that fitted shape that I had in my other shirts. And I have not yet modified my pattern to fit my new size, so my pattern pieces are still going to be too big. I'm going to have to do some work on that. But I bought another commercial pattern that had several different style options. It's a button down front, but it has short sleeves and cap sleeves and long sleeves and fancy things that you can put on the button placket to make a different style. It's got multiple collars, fold over collars or stand up collars. I think you could do it without a collar at all, potentially, but there are many different pattern styles, many different shirt styles that you can make from this single pattern. I thought that sounds great. And so here's the first one that I made. Again, using quilting cotton. This is the cap sleeves and the stand-up collar. This one has 5 buttons, sort of a V-neck, but it's a fitted button-down shirt. So it's got darts down the front and darts down the back so that the waist comes in nicely. Again, I was very careful to take my measurements before I bought the pattern and grade the pattern according to my measurements, and it fits great. So it's such a nice feeling to put on clothing that actually was made to fit your body. I can't describe how wonderful that is. How many times I've gone to a store and put on clothing and it pulls here and it gaps there and it bags here, and I feel so much of an outsider because I can't just pick a garment off the rack and have it fit me. But if I make it to fit me, it fits me and it's comfortable. So 10 out of 10, definitely would recommend sewing your own clothing. So that was the first one of these. I will be making this pattern again. We'll try the other collar and sleeve combinations, maybe some different fabrics as well. One thing about the quilting cotton that I recently learned, I took all of these shirts with me on a trip, and in my bag they got unbelievably wrinkled, and I had never done so much ironing on a trip than I had to do for this. So the quilting cotton does have some drawbacks, but something to keep in mind. So there you have it, my hand sewn wardrobe. I will definitely continue hand sewing. Shirts are great, but the coat was a lot of fun and I would definitely recommend it. I think that's it for this video. Thank you so much for spending some of your creative time with me. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!